Okay, so as I gaze out over this sea of smiling faces, I can see that for the most part, we're well into the second half of life. And if you're like me and you identify as a baby boomer, the latest saying that I read is that we're in life's third act. We're in the final act of our life. And when I first read that, I kind of took exception to that, and I said, well, what are they trying to do? You know, I've still got some good years left. Are they trying to sweep us off the stage and get some new act that's more young and more exciting or something? And I wasn't very happy. But as I began thinking, using my limited knowledge of theater and that, I did study Shakespeare in school and some of the Greek playwrights. And of course, a classical play does have 3 acts. But the third act is not just something that's tacked on to round out the evening and the thing just kind of gradually fades away. No. Actually, if you think about it, the third act is the culmination of all of the action that took place since the very beginning of the play. It culminates in some grand crescendo, and there's a resolution of the tension or the seeming conflict which the principal characters have been embroiled in since the beginning of the play. And so there's some kind of a resolution that happens, and if it's a good play, it's a resolution that satisfies the audience. So I like that analogy, and I think what that really comes down to as far as this talk is that all of us that identify as baby boomers that are in that last act, we need to be thinking about what is it that really matters most. You know, as those days get fewer, we don't know how many we have, of course, but the stuff that doesn't matter slips away. We need to be, if we want to have that culmination, if we want to have that resolution, it's about being involved with what matters most. So before I launch into the deep on this, I went to the internet, and they have some of life's most important questions, and how important they are, you be the judge of that, but they certainly are perplexing questions. Such mind-boggling questions as, why are there Braille signs that drive up ATM windows? Or why didn't Luke Skywalker tell Darth Vader to turn to the light side of the Force? Why doesn't super glue stick to its container? Or here's a good one that you might not have ever considered, but somebody on the internet did. Why is there an expiration date on sour cream? And for you cat lovers, if you throw a cat out a car window, does it become kitty litter?
Oh, that's bad.
And here's another one for cat lovers, a little kinder to the cat, I think. Since cats always land on their feet and jelly bread always lands jelly side down, what happens if you tie jelly bread to the back of a cat? I don't think I want to know. I'm glad Ron isn't here. Anyway, we want to get into what matters most here today, apart from the internet. And that quote by Jack Kornfield, that was really a great template. Some places you see it attributed to the Buddha, but he was actually writing a book of something about the sayings of the Buddha, but I think it's actually his own word. And so these 3 general categories of what matters most, and I hope to stir you up in your own thinking this way. And of course they are that we love fully, that we live gently, and that we let go gracefully. So, loving fully. And I need to confess that I don't consider myself, even though I'm in the third act of my life, I don't consider myself to be an expert in the area of love. And it's kind of like, you know, why do people become psychologists and psychiatrists? It's because they have emotional problems, and so they want to find out and study how the mind works, so maybe they can straighten their own psyche out and maybe help a few other people in the process. So it's the same idea with ministers. Well, why does somebody become a minister? You know, and the reason is because he or she really doesn't quite get what love is about, and they want to try to find some answers and dedicate their life to that and maybe help some people in the process. Because for me, you know, on a good day, on a bad day, love just seems like a four-letter word and everybody's using it in a different sense, and it's just endlessly bandied about, and there's too many people bandying it about and not enough people doing it. So, but I do have a few gleanings, a few things from my own experience that I'd like to pass on to you and see what you feel about these. And the first is the idea that love is a choice rather than a feeling. And some people might dispute that, and if there is confusion around that, it's because when we first begin to mature into our idea of what love is, it's usually in the tender age of youth, when we quote-unquote fall in love with somebody. I don't like that term, of course, but what it really means is that you're physically attracted to somebody else's body, you like the way they look, you want to be with them. So it's teenage lust, it's infatuation, it's desire, whatever you want to call it, which isn't love, but if it's tended, it could lead to love. But right from the beginning, the nature of love is to draw us, get us out of our comfort zone and to bring us into something that's larger than ourselves. In the case of these two infatuated adolescents, these two infatuated self-centered adolescents, it suddenly dawns on them that there's something important in the world beyond the end of their nose. And it's not a thing, it's not an object. You know, it's actually another person with all their foibles, with all of their likes and dislikes. And of course, if you want to advance in your relationship with them, you better find out what they really like, and you better try manifesting what they like in a lot of abundance so they'll stick around. And it might mean doing things you really don't like to do. I mean, say you can't stand Italian food, but you find out that your beloved absolutely loves Italian food. You're probably going to be spending some quality time in Italian restaurants, and of course each date it's a more expensive Italian restaurant. But it's the beginning of drawing us into something bigger. And then let's say this relationship really does blossom and take off, and it leads to marriage. And as ministers often would like to say in a premarital counseling situation, it's not just two people coming together, it's actually two families coming together, two constellations, all these individuals again coming into your life with their own particular idiosyncrasies and likes and dislikes. And of course, this is the time of the year that they're apt to show up at your dinner table on Thanksgiving Day saying, "Feed me, feed me," and all of the dynamics or drama, as the case might be, around that, and all the jokes that go with that. But you know, even if we pass all of those tests, about all I can say is we're only halfway to knowing what love is about, because love is too big to be lavished on just one person. And this is what Jesus said in the Gospel of Luke about love. He says, if you love them who love you, what thank do you have? For sinners also love those that love them. And if you do good to them which do good to you, what thank do you have? For sinners also do the same. And if you lend to them of whom you hope to receive, what thank do you have? For sinners also lend to sinners and receive as much again. But love your enemies, and do good and lend, hoping for nothing again. And your reward shall be great, and you shall be the children of the Most High, for God is kind to the unthankful and to the wicked. So, and particularly as we move into the second half of life, this really has to do with the call of sacred service. We're maybe less involved with families, depending on what your situation is, but there is that higher call, that call to sacred service, and sometimes in spiritual centers people ask, you know, is there a more advanced teaching to science of mind besides what you believe in tends to show up as your experience? And there really isn't. But if there were to be a more advanced teaching, it would be the idea that once we use these principles and get our lives working reasonably well, so we're not constantly in victimhood all the time, now we can see clearly And now we discover others. We discover that we have certain innate capacities to love, which are spiritual gifts, and we can exercise these, whether it's being a good listener, whether it's being, service-oriented minister like a board member, whether it's speaking, whether it's music, all kinds of different things that we can help people and give. And from my experience, I will tell you that is really where the juice is. That's where it's happening as far as love is concerned. And so it's that idea, that mandate of sacred service. So now we want to talk a little about living gently. And I'd like to open this up for a couple brief shares. When I say that what matters most is that we live gently, what does that mean to any of you? Anybody have any thoughts that immediately come to mind? Living gently. What does that mean to anybody?
Non-argumentative.
All right. Don't argue with people. Yeah, that's part of it.
Be kind.
Be kind. Okay. Anything else?
No stress.
Avoid stress.
Avoid stress.
The holidays are coming up, so it's good to avoid stress. Anything else?
Avoid anxiety.
Avoid anxiety, yes.
Yes.
That's along the line of street.
Bend to the needs of others.
What's that?
Bend to the needs of others.
Yes, considering the needs of others, absolutely.
Give them a sympathetic ear.
Sympathy, yes. Listening, sympathy.
Keep a sense of humor about everything, especially the serious stuff.
Oh yeah, a good sense of humor, that's being gentle. It's being gentle on yourself. You don't take yourself too seriously. And I always have to remind myself about that too, For me, being an outdoors person and involved in supporting various conservation type groups, I think the first thing that comes to mind for me is living gently on the earth, recycling and being careful if you have a septic system, what chemicals you pour down the drain, watching your carbon footprint, and also being kind to all sentient beings, even the six-legged and eight-legged type, what my neighbor collectively calls the creepy crawlies. And I was out in my hot tub the other day, and it was a sunny day, but it was kind of breezy. There was one of these giant tarantula-killing wasps. It was about that long, with the orange wings and kind of bluish-black body. And they're attracted to water, and it was thirsty, and it was hovering over the hot tub and trying to land on the ledge there to get some water. But a sudden downdraft came, and of course it landed right in the middle of the hot tub with me in it, and the jets were bubbling up, and it wasn't going to make it. I mean, those jets are pretty fierce, So I had my choice there, I could just sit there and watch the thing die. And I mean, that kind of ruins what's supposed to be a relaxing time in my hot tub. I have a dead wasp, big dead wasp in the hot tub. But I didn't want to put my hand there, because if it got on my hand, who knows, that'd be a pretty painful sting. I finally just bit the bullet, and I just got a big thing of water, just flipped it out as quick as I could, and out onto the patio there. And by the time I got out of the hot tub, the wasp had dried off, and it looked like he was going to make it. He was walking around, and I really felt good about that, because I was able to help a living creature to live and see another day. But do we care about wasps? I don't know.
That's what tarantulas do.
Yeah, the tarantulas. There was a tarantula in my house the other day too, but I just left him alone. But of course, other human beings. Most of you, your sharing was about other human beings. We ought to show kindness and patience, to give each other the benefit of the doubt, realizing that we all have bad days. We all have days that we didn't get our full night's rest, or we might not be feeling our 100% best, or maybe we're going through emotional stress or issues, whatever. And so just deferring and being kind. And of course, if you see someone who's doing good in whatever capacity, be very vocal to praise that and just compliment them and encourage them on the path, because we all need that as well. So now I want to go on, though, to letting go gracefully. This subject seems to come up a lot right now for me, and I want to camp on this a little bit. I actually had a few things to say about this in my last talk on autumn, those of you that were here. Legends of the Fall. And of course, somebody said that life is really about letting go. And it was the Buddha himself who said that all suffering comes through attachment to forms. And of course, the ultimate let go is when we face the physical death, the death of the physical body. We have to release that physical body and cross over the veil into the unknown place there. And I think that's the kind of the capital of all let go, so I'm going to address that specifically. And because if you can get a handle on that, you can probably get a handle on some of the lesser let goes. But I was up at my cabin a few weeks ago, shutting it down for the season. And it was pretty nice weather up there, but there was one perfect day. The sun was out, it was sparkling, it was dry, it was cool in the shade, it was warm in the sun, and the deer hunting season had just ended, so there were no hunters, hiding in the bushes, and it was a weekday, so there was not hardly anybody up there, and so I just drove my car deep into the forest. There's this one favorite area. I have a really deep, solitary canyon. There are a lot of neat birds and stuff in there, and I just walked up this gentle road, just a long meandering walk, and just let my mind go wherever it will. And it's kind of like a walking meditation, and I highly recommend that to you because it's so refreshing. It was a rich experience, but oddly I found my mind dwelling on the subject of death, and it wasn't that it was a morbid thing. It was really more about the idea that how we resist that particular event, and we do anything to put it away from us another week, another month, as far away as we can. And yet as I began to think about it and what that experience might be like, I also had to realize that there was part of me that very much desired the kind of consciousness that death represents, namely when boundaries dissolve and we don't have this sense of isolation and separation, and we're just caught up in the oneness of all things. The highest forms of ecstatic bliss that are imaginable to the human consciousness are the most desirable, and yet they most resemble death. So there's this great paradox. We greatly abhor this, but we greatly desire it. And I'm beginning to think, well, am I losing it up here? Is the altitude getting to me or something? But I realized that the Apostle Paul wrote about this in one of his letters, 2 Corinthians chapter 5. He says this, in this body we groan, earnestly desiring to be clothed upon with our house which is from heaven, if so be that being clothed we shall not be found naked. For we that are in this tabernacle, this body, do groan being burdened, not that we would be unclothed, but clothed upon, that mortality might be swallowed up by life. So there's this dear intertwinement between life and death. They're seemingly such opposites, but extreme opposites. It's kind of like they bend around and they actually touch each other, so they're almost two parts of the same thing. Kind of like in alchemy, there's what they call the Ouroboros, which is actually a lizard that bends around and eats its tail. And so there's this idea then of these opposites. And there's this, well, I'm going to read you from the Tibetan Book of the Dead, this is an interesting thing. And if you think about the description of the mystics and people who have gone to these high places, samadhi and that sort of thing, these out-of-the-body experiences and different things, and you see how they describe it, and then you read descriptions of people that have had near-death experiences and how they describe it, and it's the same thing. You see, they're seeing the same thing. Here's what the Tibetan Book of the Dead says. And by the way, on these books of the dead, there's two senses, and then again, this is kind of what I'm saying. There's two senses of this. There's the exoteric aspect of this, which is it was written as a prayer book for people who are in the dying process, making their transition, to guide them successfully through the discarnate states and into their next incarnation. And of course, if they did it right, there would not be another incarnation. They would escape from the wheel of suffering. They would not have to go through another incarnation to work out anything more. But the esoteric aspect is actually, because people who have the mystical experiences say they're saying the same thing. The esoteric is, it's a guide to people who are adepts, who are penetrating the depths of inner space, a unitive experience, to guide them through this inner labyrinth of their own consciousness in a unitive sense, and to help them to come out and emerge as a more integrated being. This is what the Tibetan Book of the Dead says. It says, remember the clear light, the pure, clear, white light from which everything in the universe comes, to which everything in the universe returns, the original nature of your own mind, the natural state of the unmanifest universe. Let go into the clear light, trust it, merge with it. It is your own nature. It is home. So, two questions I'd like to ask you around this idea. And the first is, because what is it really that we fear letting go of anything, but in particular letting go into physical death? What is it that we fear? And while different things could be brought forth, I think the ultimate thing is we fear obliteration. We fear that beyond that there's just nothing. That's the absolute end. There's nothing. The other question I'd like to ask you is, what if these boundaries, these things that so define us, that we think so define us, what if these things that we think so define us really aren't what define us at all? They're simply illusions. And that if they were obliterated, all that would be left wouldn't be nothing, it would be all that we truly are. And if that's the case, you see, letting go then isn't the feared nothingness, it's the revered everythingness. So I just invite you, if you're in a place where you're struggling with letting go of something, I just invite you to consider the testimony of the sacred scriptures, the testimony of the mystics, my own testimony from my own experiences. I've shared them with you. And as the saying goes, feel the fear and do it anyway. So we've been talking about some general areas of what matters most: loving fully, living gently, letting go gracefully. You'll notice though, and I was thinking about this when I made the title, I put a question mark at the end of the title. What matters most is a question. Because I don't really know what matters most to you. And I think I've done my job as a speaker today if this has gotten you to think about what matters most to you, and maybe, as the affirmation says, give yourself permission to move into that, to bring about that culmination of your life's process and that satisfactory resolution of what your life is really about, your life addressing life with the capital L. So I'm going to leave you with a quote from Jesus out of the book of Matthew. The context is, of course, the Jewish tradition. Their sacred text is the Torah, which is the law and the prophets. And he was teaching teachers, basically, people who had studied the Torah since they were children. And one of them asked him, he said, "Master, what is the greatest commandment of all?" And he said, "The greatest commandment is you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. And the second commandment is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. On these two precepts hang all the law and the prophets." So blessings to you today.